There we go. So today's the first session of this series, paper writing tips for success. Again, thank you to all of those who have sent us questions in advance. We've got 4 panelists here from different roles and career stages. They are Marie-Laure Bagard, she's MCIC PMS lab manager at Cambridge. David Wilson, he's an IRF in UCL. Susan Little, a lecturer at UCL, and Wes Fraser, who's a reader at Oxford Brookes. I don't know if you have anything else that you would like to say to introduce yourselves, or if you want to just get straight to the questions. Let me stop my share. So the first one, I guess, is a general one. What is your process? How do you start writing a paper? Do you have a specific part that you write first or last? How is it for you?
I think for me, I like to get the pictures in place first, if you know what I mean. I like to get my figures, get my data sorted out, draft my figures, any maps, and for me, I'm quite a simple beast. I make a little PowerPoint show for myself, and I just sort of put the figures in the order that I think should sort of make the final cut of the paper, and then kind of weave the story, if you like, around the figures. So it keeps me on track. So I get sort of distracted very easily when I'm thinking about things. So having a PowerPoint of the figures in the right order helps me sort of keep the flow and sort of see, sort of almost signpost where I'm going next when I actually come to the writing stage.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I would even say I would even take a step back, and I think my first port of call is to look at other similar papers, so other people who've done similar work. Most likely you're not the first to do your particular thing, or even if you are the first to measure your particular isotope system, there'll be somebody else who's measured something else for the first time. So that's usually my first port of call, is like, okay, I've got a data set on aerosols in the Atlantic. Who else has written about aerosols, and how did they structure their paper, and what did they do with their data? That's usually my first port of call, I think.
I can add something as well, which is, I think what Wes says makes a lot of sense. But I would say you'd also, probably most times I've started writing a paper, I've already given some kind of a talk on that paper. So in terms of in a conference setting, but also maybe just in a lab group or a department seminar. So once you've got data together, start to think about how that makes a story, and try and tell that story to either just your peers in your office or maybe a lab group meeting. And then that's normally quite a good basis for then moving to that next formal step of writing a paper, because you've already tried to tell it as a story, so and put things into some kind of order and structure. So in most cases, that's how I've probably first started writing a paper, is from having given a presentation or a talk or an informal sort of structured step through of some figures before I've sat down to actually write the paper.
I think I agree with everything that's been said. I also will start with figures, and I try to put next to my figures bullet points of what they tell me and where I'm going from there, and maybe like add some sort of like connection or transition between the different figure or the different step of my story, and then I build around that structure. But yeah, I guess knowing which data exactly you have and which figure helps you tell a story is really the first step to start your paper.
So it seems like you're all pretty agreed on being very data and figure focused to begin with. We had quite a few questions about data. So how to go from kind of just the data that you get out to a well-rounded story about it, but also how to know how much data you need for one paper, when to split it up into multiple papers. when is it enough? Yeah, and this might be too many things to ask at one time. So I guess I'll leave that one there for
I think what David said actually about sort of test running your data on the lab groups or colleagues or a conference, I think that's a really good start. In terms of, you know, when you're giving a presentation, you certainly at a big conference, you're normally pretty tight on time. You know, EGU is what 12 minutes of talking. It's like super succinct, and to be able to convey that volume of information in such a tight time frame, it's quite a skill in its own right. And that's almost like another sort of seminar, webinar series actually, is giving really short conference talks. But at the end, you normally have your summary, your slide, your conclusion. And often the best ones sort of finish with like sort of 3 points, like really short, sharp, clear headline points. And I think to sort of address what you sort of question was, I think if you can summarize your findings in 3 points, that's probably about right for a paper. You know, that volume that you can summarize in those 3 key sort of takeaway messages at the end of a short conference talk, that kind of guides what would go into that paper. And if you've got 4 or 5 or 6 bullet points, then I think at that point maybe either consider how waffly you are when you write, or maybe you've got a lot more data, and that is, you know, maybe 2 papers. So I think that's quite a useful tool, that to test drive your data first in some sort of presentation format and see what naturally fits into a story that can be summarized in you know, 3 headline points or take-home messages. Any more, you've got a bit too much, you can think about your second paper, which is a great position to be in.
Thanks, Wes. Anything else to add to that?
I guess I need to say that there's not a hard and fixed sort of amount of data that you need to go into a paper, I think. You sort of need enough data to, if you're writing a paper, you generally have a story that you're trying to tell or a point or two that you're trying to get across. And you need a strong enough data set to support those, sort of robustly support those points. So in terms of the resolution of a record through time, or a number of experiment runs that you've conducted. So it's more a case of, do you have enough to make those points strongly? Then you need 200 isotope measurements for a paper. So I think it's, you know, what do you need to to put across your point robustly is enough for a paper, but equally sort of without trying to be, you know, in some cases you'll see people try and chop up their data so much to try and get more papers out of it. And that's just really frustrating. So if you can't properly tell the story because you put the concentration data in one paper and the isotope data in a second paper, then or at least I find that really annoying. So ideally make it quite a closed sort of paper that does tell the full story, not a bit of the story, because you'll tell the other bit, you know, a year later.
Yeah, I think I agree. You have to tell a complete story. You can't sort of tell a part story. So like some sort of serialized story in a newspaper. It's got to be a complete package. Sorry, I think Marie-Laure was about to speak. I'll be quiet for
No, I was just going to say that it can also happen that the type of project means that you can't get that many data. And it doesn't mean that you can't get a paper out of it or it's not relevant. Like if it's very new data, it's like an exceptionally new technique or a very challenging place to go on field work, or sometimes these few data, because there are not that many out there, are very important. And even if you don't have like 50 samples, it's okay, because it will be a huge progress from what's already out there and valuable to all those in your field anyway. So yeah, it's really project dependent, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I'd also suggest it's stage dependent as well. You know, sort of. I remember one of the most depressing figures I saw in a paper that a postdoc, his first paper out of the postdoc that was working with us, put together. It summarized my entire PhD in not even a figure, in sort of half a figure. And you sort of look back and go, oh, wow, I spent 3.5 years just for part of a figure. Oh, but actually, I mean, you reflect on it, you think, well, actually, that's kind of where you want to be a few years down the line, is that your data that you've spent a long time generating does get summarized as a brief little figure, because it means that actually you've set the scene, you've laid the foundation for quite a lot that's come later on. So yeah, it's very much a time dependent thing. It's very much dependent on how much data you have, how much data is appropriate, and what's gone before, really.
Yeah, and maybe just to add it's just something, it's also at this point where it's important to consider which paper you're going to publish in, because some papers will be more appropriate for very big data set, and yeah, some other will be more appropriate for a much more focused work.
So that that brings me to another block of questions quite nicely, Marie-Laure. Thanks. How to decide what journal to aim for, and whether it's best to write with a particular journal in mind from the beginning, or to just start writing and then adapt it to whatever journal you choose to once you've got a bit more meat on the bones. Seems like it's two different approaches to doing it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm curious to hear what the other panelists, how they approach it. Personally, I do usually have something in mind, a journal in mind, depending on essentially what Marie-Laure was saying, like, or relating to the previous question. Do I have like basically one really punchy, clear story, in which case I can probably go relatively short, and I might go for, say, geology or something? Or do I actually have like a kind of larger data set which isn't really so clear cut, which I still can build a relatively nice story about, but which I'm going to need more space, in which case I might think about GCA, for example. So I usually, based on the data I have, I usually kind of look at the journals that I typically read and see. That's the other aspect of it, I guess, is that the journals have themselves a scope. So it's worth going to the journal website and reading that scope, like what do they accept? What are they looking for? And how does that fit with what you have to contribute to the field at that time? But yeah, it's not, I'm curious, as I say, curious to hear how others approach that.
I think, yeah, Susan, I think you've got that sort of spot on, really. Kind of, it depends on how much you have to say. And I guess sort of how timely, how relevant, I guess, how sexy a story you have to sort of pitch, and there's how high you can go up the rankings of impact factor journals. And I guess so for me, I normally sort of, and again, it's kind of down to those that you read on a regular basis, those journals that you normally tend towards within your field. For me, I normally sort of pick, I don't know, certainly sort of 3 or maybe 4 journals that I would be happy to see the paper go to, and sort of they'll generally be of the same sort of level, the same sort of scope roughly, but maybe just some different subsections of the community, and sort of, yeah, be happy that they'd go, hopefully go in one of those, and sort of write to, you know, sort of whichever I think is top of my list. Just sometimes you just put them in order, it was alphabetical order, whatever order feels right for you at that moment in time, and then just work down that list in terms of writing, and, you know, write for the one at the top of the list, and then work through the process of peer review and so on, which again is almost certainly another webinar topic. So yeah, I know, to answer your question, Susan, I normally have 3 or 4 that I'd be happy to see it go into.
Yeah, maybe the first question is it short or long, essentially, and then that basically that's the big decision when you start writing. Are you going for short or are you going for long? And then actually maybe within those 2 categories there's probably a lot of options, but that's the decision you need to make when you start writing.
I think for me that's always, is it short or shorter?
But Wes, when you're doing that and making your potential journals list, would you then, do you plump for sending it to one that you think is like slightly out of range for what you're trying to do, but it has a higher impact factor, but they're maybe more likely to reject you or ask for a lot of changes.
Yeah,
or,
every time.
Or something that you're
every time go high, aim high, you know. Yeah, it will do. Certainly, if you're early career, it will serve you well in the longer run. Certainly, sort of, if you're a PhD student, you're submitting something. Your first postdoc, they'll be looking at your papers. And if you're a postdoc, they'll your next position, next postdoc or fellowship or an academic position. People will look at your reference list, your publications list, and those that are in the higher ranking journals, they're going to carry a bit more weight. It's going to only serve you well in the long run. So from a career perspective, yeah, always aim a bit higher. Yes, you might get rejected. That's quite likely, but then such is the way of the academic world. You know, papers get rejected all the time. Funding proposals get rejected even more often. You know, rejection is part of the academic process, and you'd have to become a little bit hardened to it. But yeah, you might get rejected, but at the same time, you've got a decent chance of getting paper published in those higher journals. So actually it pays off. And if you get like, I don't know, 1 in 6 papers in the higher end of the spectrum that you sort of take a punt on, then well, that's a good result. You know, I think it's all too easy to do yourself down. You know, we're all our own worst critics generally. I think it's all too easy to do yourself down a little bit and think, oh, I'll just go to that lower ranking journal because, well, I might get an easier ride. Push yourself, try a bit harder. You know, you'll be surprised at what you're doing, how good whatever the research is that you're doing actually is. So yeah, shoot for the stars.
I was just going to add maybe a slightly different perspective than Wes there, which is only to say, I think maybe on that sort of short format, high impact, sort of longer journals, I'm probably a bit more of a pragmatist. But I think if you're a PhD student or early career, then it's worth being more targeted. So figuring out which is your result or story, you know, that's most relevant beyond, say, your very narrow field of geochemistry, and maybe fits that shorter format, and which story maybe needs that long space to put together. You know, a method development paper somewhere is not going to fly in science, so don't waste everyone's time. So be a bit targeted about which is your exciting story that's relevant a bit beyond your discipline, and which is really just targeting geochemists. And then you can go down those 2 lines of writing a EPSL GCA style paper for a closer field, which is still top journals. And, you know, in my case, I'd say where my best work is in, probably. But on the other hand, it's a really useful experience to find something where you think, yeah, this is what my PhD is about. I think this is exciting. I want to tell more people, and to aim for, be it Nature, be it Nature Geoscience, be it Geology, be it GRL. And the practice of writing in that short format is so useful. I found that a really useful thing when I was first pushed a couple of times to write for that shorter format, because it makes you a much better writer. Even if that paper doesn't, you know, get anywhere, it means you hone your writing skills by trying to write for a short format. So even if it's not successful, it will make all your other papers better, I think. So it's worth, so I agree with Wes, it's worth, don't be ashamed of, don't think that, oh, my work's not as good as other people, but do be a bit targeted. But it's a really useful skill, I think, to aim for writing something that's more concise than we're maybe used to.
Okay, to flip back a little bit to tie in with something Susan said in her answer to that one. You were talking about getting data from, in some cases you might have data from different sources, and we had a question of how to integrate into one paper data that you might have from geochemistry, structural maps, fieldwork data. How can you know, keep that kind of shorter format paper that you're talking about, David, and tie everything?
Okay. I think it becomes difficult, right, when you're trying to go across disciplines, which is kind of what you're doing if you're trying to include structural and map work, maybe field work with sort of petrology, geochemistry. One solution is that all the details have to go into a supplement, of course, and you have to really summarize in the main paper. So all the methods would have to be in a supplement, and the main paper would have to summarize, this is this tool, this tells us about, exhumation histories, this is this tool, this tells us about this is what this picture looks like overall. So you'd have to push the details into a supplement and be really clear that you summarize how to interpret the data from each of those different tools that you're combining for people who are obviously not necessarily experts in all those fields. Maybe the better way, or the other way to do that, is thinking back to what Wes was saying earlier, is potentially you maybe have a structural mapping based paper that can do that properly, and for that audience, and sets the scene for your field area and presents presents maybe the field data, and then subsequently you could then have a sort of shorter format paper which takes, okay, here's our structural map, here's what we suggested from the structural data, we're now going to add in our isotope tracer data and put together this bigger story. And then you don't feel like you've relegated the important work to a supplement. You've already got that paper that shows I'm a structural geologist, I've done this field work, and then it's like, oh, and I'm also a geochemist, and I'm going to draw this together in this second paper. So one thing is, it may be something where you simply need to sort of separate that into perhaps into two papers.
So even if your kind of current way of looking at these data sets is that they do all feed into 3 big point conclusions, that maybe sometimes there's too much for those 3 big point conclusions, find the 3 smaller point conclusions that some of the data makes and then add to that. Is that what you're...
Yeah, I mean, if you have 3 big point conclusions, but they need a huge amount of data from different fields to get to them, then it may be worth thinking about whether there's a sensible way to separate an observation-based paper from a kind of interpretive big picture synthesis, including some other like new tools like geochemistry tools.
Also, if you have very different, different aspects to your work, they may not be like, you may not want to reach the exact same community with your paper. And so it's also more efficient if you have, one paper aimed maybe more at the structural geologist community and another that's more geochemistry. And if you try to have everything in one big paper, you may not, you may not make as much of an impact on, So, if it's, I think that if there's really a lot with different area, it's probably a good thing to think about how you could just split it in different papers, because we talked earlier about not splitting data too much, but sometimes it's actually, it makes it easier for everybody and has a stronger impact.
Sure, you could have multiple papers that make the points and then eventually get to Wes's position of having a part figure that actually is what one of the original papers was, but you've kind of distilled it because you've had that space to talk about it in full.
So, for example, isotope geochemistry data, for example, they will actually be often the final step, because before, to properly interpret them, you need to have often you need to have like a lot of context, like geological or just like a good understanding of how the major elements maybe behave, or so so it just does make sense to have like your final isotope geochemistry paper that will build on everything that's behind and make an additional point in your story.
I think one of the biggest challenges of writing a paper is if your work does cut across fields. I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges to the sales pitch, if you like, of putting into that paper. Because who do you try and sell that paper to? I mean, you sort of mentioned sort of talking to structural geologists and isotope geochemists, but you know, the stuff I work on, one paper might be talking to ecologists, the next paper physical geographers, next paper organic geochemists, and then you know another paper might be sort of more paleobiology, environmental change stuff. So they're really quite different fields to try and engage with, and sort of norms and the processes that you're expecting. You know, if it's going to an ecology field, it has to be very stats rich. Whereas you know you talk to a geologist, a paleobiology geologist, sort of working deep time stuff. You know, if you've got an example of one, that's enough. You know, it's a very different sort of audience, and I think sometimes reconciling that it is one of the biggest challenges, getting it right. And yeah, I think Marie-Laure's right. It's kind of sometimes you want to be careful of sort of salami slicing things too much, but sometimes you do need to slice up and send a paper to each of the respective communities that it's most appropriate for. And yeah, then you end up with, like you say earlier, the summary paper that brings it all together and ties it up into a nice story, which is probably one of the shorter format papers that's the sort of the bigger headline sort of output, if you like.
Okay, thanks. How do you write an introduction that feels fresh when it's covering the same sort of information that's been included in many other introductions on the same topic?
Okay, I'll go at this one. I mean, to some extent you don't. That's not what the purpose of an introduction is. But you can do it. You do at the same time you do, because so Wes has talked about 3 key points in a paper. I would actually say 1 is enough, and you can have some other secondary arguments if you like, but really you want 1 key thread which goes through the whole paper, and your introduction is going to set up that thread, and it's going to run actually all the way through from the title to the conclusions. And the introduction is very important because it sets the stage for what is this gap in knowledge that this paper is going to fill. So basically your introduction is setting up the question which you're going to answer, and that answer is your 1 key point to the paper. So I mean, in the end, an introduction is kind of the only place where you're allowed to literature review. The rest of the paper, you have to focus on your own data, and that's often a problem that I see in discussions, for example, is people just go into the literature review. That's not what a discussion is for, but it is to some extent what the introduction is for. But yeah, I think it needs to set up the question, which is your answer in your paper. I don't know if that's it's a bit vague, but that's kind of how I go about an introduction. What is my key thread, and setting the foundation for that thread.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I'm very similar. I think introductions are really important, and I do tend to write an introduction first, or when I'm working on a paper. I do want to have that, because for me that sets up the story that I'm going to tell. It sets up the narrative, and I want so. But in terms of what you then have to do in that introduction, I think obviously you're referencing sort of saying what is the state of play in a given field, and it's where you're kind of giving credit to other people and saying we know some stuff already, right? So it's a good place to say that this is kind of the status quo. This has been a really important seminal work. This is why we care about this subject. And then it's like, as Susan says, this is the bit we don't understand. This is the thing we don't know, and that I'm going to bring some new evidence on in my paper. So I think it is giving people that background to the field, and this is your background reading, and this is what we know, so that you know how the isotope system works. Those kind of things normally make it into the introduction, but it should be different from maybe the second half of the introduction should end up being different from other papers, because it should be focused on which bit of that story you're telling. So it shouldn't have to cover everything. It should be directed towards your focus on, the geochemical cycle of cadmium, or the, ocean circulation in the Pleistocene. It should be much more targeted, I think, than some people write in introductions.
I'm interested if people have a view here on whether the introduction should give the punchline or not as well. I would just add that to the question for the panel.
I would say no. I mean, draw your reader in, get them to read the whole lot. But no, from the serious point, I think the punchline should be at the end, and you should sort of go on a journey together with your reader to reach that punchline. Otherwise, I think, you know, that from a reader perspective, you might, if you get the punchline early on, you might not pay enough attention to some of the details later in the paper that actually sort of add weight to what it is you're saying, or sort of underpin what you're saying. And just thinking back to what David said, I must admit I'm a bit naughty. I normally write my introductions later on in the process. I normally have my results and discussion in place before I write my introduction, so I know where I'm going at.
No, to be fair, I mean, that does just make the point that there isn't one way to do these things. But also, of course, I will go back and obviously when my discussion has taken me somewhere else, of course, I will go back and rewrite the introduction, or adapt the introduction as necessary. I'm with you, Wes, and I guess maybe Susan, but in saying that I wouldn't give the results in the introduction, the kind of take-home points. I try to avoid that. I'm probably co-author on some things where people have done that. I don't personally like it, but I think it is personal preference as well. Some people like to think that, you know, and in fact, some people do that in talks these days as well, right? Here's what you're going to take home from my talk. And I'm like, well, I don't need to listen to the next 10 minutes then. So I don't like it personally, but I do think it is maybe that is a personal preference.
And again, I think it comes back to the idea of audience, who your audience is. You know, if you're talking to a very different field, again, sort of what Susan said earlier about sort of before approaching a paper, you read around other papers. Particularly if you're crossing the boundaries into a slightly different field, or an entirely different field to where you normally work, you do have to get a sense of what your audience is like and what they sort of ordinarily expect from a paper. And if that field does sort of reveal the answer at the end of the introduction, then, well, maybe you should adhere to that general principle. You know, so you're very much targeting what you're writing to your audience, which you've tried to gain a familiarity with. So again, there's no sort of hard and fast right answer. There's multiple approaches to addressing the same sort of thing. Yeah, I think knowing your audience is probably key to getting the writing right.
I guess in the whether to include the answer in the introduction, that would be really handing someone very nicely the thread, Susan, that you were talking about, that's going to take them through. So they've got kind of the context of where it will lead as they're still kind of getting there. So David, you do your introduction first. Sorry, Susan, did you have no? Wesley, you leave that as late as possible. What about Marie-Laure and Susan? Where do you start? What's your
Where do
first?
I start?
Well,
Sorry, you broke up. Who were you addressing that to?
Well, anyone. Which section do you write first?
I write the boring bits first, the methods and the results. Because then, especially if you're struggling to get started, those are things that are quite easy to do, really. It's just a question of sitting down, writing down the words. It's not particularly brain challenging normally. And that will give you the encouragement then to be like, oh, I've already got 500 words and I didn't even really have to think that much. And so that can be a really good motivator, especially if you're struggling to start. That's what I would do. Although I must say, I also like writing the introduction quite early, but I think David and I are quite similar in the way we write papers. So.
I think
go for it. Yeah, so what were they going? Now sorry, now I've just forgotten what I was about to say.
All right. Well, I'll say some things, and then yeah, you'll probably remember. I guess. No, I've nearly forgotten what I was going to say now. I think I agree fully with Susan. It's kind of getting the boring stuff out of the way. That I mean, writing methods, and I find writing results really tedious. It's just sort of it gets quite repetitive. If you've got a slightly longer format paper, I feel it quite. It's a bit tedious. You just get it over and done with. But what it does serve to do, because as Susan rightly says, it takes very little brain power to actually do that part. It breaks down the sort of barrier of the blank screen, which I don't know about anybody else. I find is hideous when I'm starting to write papers. You open a Word document and you look at the screen and it's just this page of white, and that's the hardest barrier to get over. Right? What I find anyway. What word do you put down first? How do you start? How do you break down that? And normally I'll put in headings, even if it's just introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, because they're easy. But it means when you look at the screen, it's not a blank page anymore. And then you can dip in, and then I'll look back at my PowerPoints, my pictures, and I go, all right, how did I make those? And you start to talk about them. So that's your results. And you think about your methods, what I actually do to get to that point, what I spent a long time in the lab, or as is the case is these days, actually, my postdoc spent a long time in the lab for me. And then you write about it. And it's a really useful starting point because you don't need that creative flair, you don't need that inherent that sort of that extra level of thinking about what it is you're saying, because you're just saying what you've done and what you can see in front of you, and that breaks down that barrier, and it means then that you get that sort of inertia, you roll into it, and you sort of build your own confidence in what you're saying and what you're writing. And it just starts to snowball, and before you know it, you've got a perfectly serviceable paper in front of you, just by breaking down that blank page barrier, dealing with the boring bits first, and then you can get stuck into the juicy bits later on.
Yeah, so I agree with all that, and with the fact that I find it much easier to start with these boring bits. I've also noticed that on occasion, sometimes like when writing and describing the data, I would notice something that maybe I had slightly overlooked before, or a data that maybe I hadn't paid quite enough attention at, that was a bit different than what I had in my mind. And and I prefer seeing that before I actually write all the discussion, because, well, often it won't make a huge difference, but that I'm sure that I have a very sound base to write my discussion, and that I won't have to change it afterwards.
Okay, thank you. So I've got a question about writing in English if it's not your first language. So one of the questions we got sent in is saying that their English is great in conversation, but it doesn't sound as good in written format. So anyone have any recommendations of improving written English?
I feel like Marie-Laure has to answer this.
Yeah.
I do want to target you,
well, yeah. Well, I guess, yeah, I'm just choice here. Well, I think reading a lot does it help improving your written English. I think that's how I got better. Of course, the ideal solution is that if you're working with someone who has a better English than yours and can correct you or like help you. It's always tricky because you don't want to ask people for too much, and the whole paper to read is quite a lot. So unless that person is a co-author, it's tricky. But yeah, I guess. Yeah, maybe if you have if you know someone who has a good written English, ask for a correction on things like abstracts and things like that, and see already if they spot things where you can improve quite easily. If if it's for a whole manuscript, I think, yeah, it's quite tricky. Really, for me, just I started with a decent English and then just reading paper and writing, I guess, yeah, writing with people who having co-author whose first language was English helped. But I'd say first rule is probably to try to keep it simple and not make too complicated sentence. Especially, I don't know, but coming from French, I tend to make like overly long sentences and also try to have like complicated grammatical structures and tense coordination. Well, forget about that, like don't bother. It's a paper, you just need to be factual. So maybe make shorter sentence until you feel a bit more comfortable. You just, yeah, you're writing a scientific paper, not a novel. So start simple.
Yeah, I was just going to say that actually, Marie-Laure. The only thing I would maybe add is that, you know, universities do have centers for written English scientific writing courses. I have never taken one, obviously, because I'm a native English speaker. Although that's not to say that native English speakers couldn't benefit from such a course, actually, sometimes. But yeah, so I mean, take a look at what your university has to offer as well.
One thing I think I'd add, well, being from Birmingham, and I don't know if what I speak is actually English or regarded as such, but I think an important thing for anyone where English is not your first language, certainly from my own perspective, and anyone that's ever read any emails that I've written, attempted to write in French, guarantee your level of English is probably going to be, you know, far beyond certainly my attempt of any other language, really. So have confidence in that, you know. I think, and Marie-Laure says, you know, keep it simple, because, you know, that's all you need to do. And actually, I think native English speakers could probably learn a lot from that, as well as, you know, why write an overly complicated sentence when a short, concise, to the point sentence will actually do a far better job. So in some respects, actually coming from a different language background may actually be a slight advantage, that it's easier to get to the point than if you've got this broader vocabulary at your fingertips. You might end up, much like I'm doing right now, waffling far too much. So I don't see it necessarily as a negative point. I think it can actually be quite advantageous, because it gets you to where you need to be the most efficiently possible. But and like Marie-Laure said about proofreading, I proofread quite a lot for non-native English speakers as friends, but I'm happy to do it because, you know, it's part of, you know, it's give and take. You know, the academic world, it's hard enough to succeed and as it is, if you can help other people get a leg up, and, you know, sort of, if it's as simple as reading a manuscript that's, you know, written by someone whose English isn't first language, and you can help them, then great. You know, it's about this community spirit. It's about helping each other where we possibly can. And I'm quite happy to spend a couple of hours reading through and tweaking some English, if that's what it takes to help them getting the paper through. You know, so I think everyone has their own take on that, and is very much time dependent. But yeah, I think we're all in the same sort of boat. We're all in the same community. So I'm always quite happy to help others out wherever possible. So I don't know if others feel the same.
All I was going to add was that your point about short, and a few people have mentioned about short, simple sentences, goes across the board, and is probably something we should all be thinking of. And so, you know, that goes whether you're native or non-native English speaking. I think you can show off that you're clever by writing things that are short and simple and easy to follow, rather than by writing long, complicated, impressive sounding sentences, right, that people can't follow. So I think that's one thing that's a more general point. My only other suggestion, so I work quite a lot with quite a few people who are non-native English speakers, like as a collaborator. So I've been looking at a lot of texts in recent years that's sort of written by non-native speakers. And to start with, it's often very impressive what they can do, even though they then need, you know, obviously some further pointers from those of us who are native English speakers. I was only going to suggest that maybe one thing, if you don't feel like you're ready to ask your, someone in your lab to read your whole paper, or a collaborator yet to read your whole paper, maybe ask a fellow PhD student to read just like an introduction or a chunk of it and edit it as they would, it was their own paper, and give some, actually give some comments or go through it with you and say, why have they changed this? Why have they done that? I suspect that it could be overwhelming if you get back a whole manuscript that's edited, but find a chunk, like an introduction, like a page, and maybe ask people, because it's a bit easier to give up an hour of time to do that than it is to give up 2 days to edit a manuscript. So that was my only thought, was that find other people who are around that will look at a small part of your work to try and give you tips, basically.
Okay, sounds good. So use your community, see what your specific institution offers, if they do. We are running relatively short on time, so how do you decide which papers to cite? There's usually many choices that you could make when you're writing about what you could put in there. What helps make that decision?
I can give a couple of quick tips. One of which, try to cite maybe the original work rather than some paper later on that's commented on it or referring back to it. So try to find maybe the original study on something rather than some random paper that mentions it. And then maybe cite the most recent update on something, the most recent review paper, something like that can be useful. And I guess cite the papers that you've read, right? It's kind of obvious, but if these are papers you found useful in developing your ideas, then cite those papers. And I guess if you're wanting to refer to the key papers in a field, it's probably quite a good practice to try and cite work from different groups, because then a reader can get a view of this being, if a reader dips into your references, they can then see, oh, this was done by different groups. They may give slightly different perspectives on it, rather than just citing all the papers by one really good group. So those are a few things.
Maybe just quickly, I know that sometimes it's very convenient when you have a review paper to cite it, but I agree with David. Try to cite people like the original work, even if you cite the review afterwards. But yeah, just don't use one review paper for all your citations. Like I've seen that, and yeah, it's not ideal.
Yeah, I was just gonna, from personal experience, if you don't cite the original author and then they review the paper, they're not going to be very happy. So.
Okay, great.
One other thing sorry,
go on, Wes. No.
I'd add is there seems, certainly with undergraduates that I teach these days, there seems to be this general sense that if a paper is beyond a certain age, then it's irrelevant and you shouldn't cite it. But not at all. If you were looking at I don't know, ozone depletion in the stratosphere and you didn't cite Molina and Rowland and 1974, it'd be a crime. It shouldn't get published, because it's not acknowledging that sort of fundamental sort of basis of where that science came from. So I guess it's a word of caution rather than anything else, is don't be scared that just because a paper is a few years older that it's no longer relevant. Some of it's absolutely fundamental to showing where that came from. Like, Susan and David just said, acknowledging those initial authors, absolutely key to sort of developing that again, telling that story within your paper. If you don't know where you've come from, you're just jumping in at the last point. It's like turning to 3/4 through a novel and just starting reading at a random page. You're sort of missing a whole load of context.
Okay. Thank you. 2 more questions. Firstly, do you have any tips for managing busy co-authors?
Give deadlines and say something like, I know everyone's busy. I'm giving you 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months, whatever. If I don't hear back, I'll assume you're okay with it. If you need more time, let me know.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. That's something I had to learn, and I learned it perhaps the hard way. So I think that sounds perfect, basically. But also just, I guess, talk to your co-authors early on, let them know that you're working on something, and figure out if they've got a really busy teaching term, plan your work around that. Don't expect to get their comments in a month if it's in the middle of their block teaching or something. So maybe just talk to them beforehand, make sure they know that 6 months from now I'm going to send you a paper, rather than like, oh, here's a paper, can you give me comments in 2 weeks' time, right? That's the only other thing, is to kind of precondition maybe that stage and talk to them, and talk to them about science as well if you want earlier on, but don't leave it to the last minute and then expect everyone to jump and leap at your command.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of those comments, but I think it's really good to get to where possible, because sometimes you don't get to know everyone, but if you're working with the same co-authors a lot, get to know their working style. Are they last minute people? Are they super organized plan people? And you can sort of adjust the deadline setting accordingly to, do you know that they'll deliver it the night before you actually ask for, but it'll be really good. They super last minute, but actually what they deliver is really useful. Or maybe you've got somebody who'll give you half a sort of set of comments within that deadline, but you know that if you push them a little bit, they might come back with the other half the following week. Get to know who you're working with and how they work and how that fits with your working style, because then that means that you can adapt and adjust timeframes and expectations accordingly to how you all work, and make sure they sort of know what sort of work how your style of working operates as well. So everyone knows and feels fully informed. Everyone knows what's going on.
Yeah, I just wanted to add very quickly, just be empathetic as well. Everyone is very busy people. Try to be flexible, and yeah, just be empathetic. That goes in general, I think, across science.
Empathy is great. So try and get an idea of who they are and how busy they're going to be and what's probably reasonable for them. And then at each stage, kind of set a deadline that's in keeping with that then they know what you're expecting of them as well. Sounds good. What is your number one top tip for someone writing their first paper?
Maybe don't try for the very first one to do everything on your own and give a perfect version to your supervisor. Like, it's hard, and feedbacks help, and your supervisor is also here to help you. So maybe give small chunks or to your supervisor regularly to progress steadily. And I think it helps. Like, every time I've struggled is really when I wanted to have something polished first, and that just doesn't work, at least for me.
I was given the word of advice from my main supervisor during my PhD, which was, don't get it right, get it written. And actually, it's like we sort of talked about, some recurring themes within this hour is kind of, a lot of the time it's just getting it down on paper, getting that sort of that blank page sort of block broken through, get your ideas out there, get them written down, and then, like Marie-Laure says, then give them to your supervisor and just say, look, this is my first stab. It's not perfect, but I think I'm on the right track. Let's have a chat about it. I think that's that'd be my tip.
I don't have anything novel to say that I haven't already said, but I think really just like trying to figure out what that one key thread is would be my, like, what is it you want to say? And then you can break that down into a detailed outline eventually. But if you can try to figure out what that key point is through discussions with your supervisor and through discussion of the data and so on, then that might help you when you come to write, possibly. But I like the other tips too. One
other thing, it sort of harks back to the thing about sort of working with co-authors and getting to know them, is don't be afraid to talk to people. You know, even if your supervisor is some lofty professor, they're just people. Talk to them. You know, certainly I know this from a work. You know, people don't like to knock on my office door and have a chat about a bit of work that they're struggling with because he hasn't got time. And if I'm looking particularly grumpy and tired, I might not have time. But generally, happy to chat. You know, so don't put. Certainly, as happens, I've seen this happen with supervisors, certainly sort of big lofty professors. Don't put them on a pedestal and think that they won't want to talk to you because you're too lowly or whatever. Just go with an idea and have a chat. Everyone in academia likes to talk about a bit of science, so they're going to be probably, unless they've got a massive deadline, really quite willing to have a chat. Don't be shy.
And I guess I haven't said anything yet. I was going to say, I'm not sure how to phrase this. I was going to say basically, don't view that you do science and think that you're, you know, I don't, maybe I'm really good at science, really good at playing with my data, really good at making it, and then get this block that writing is then this other thing that you can't do. I would say view the writing as just like another part of the scientific process. And so actually, having given you this impression that I sit there and have this introduction, have this paper in mind and write this beautiful narrative, and it's all really easy, that's not at all the case. So I think these days especially, a lot of the science ends up happening when you're in the process of writing the paper. And so I think it's actually just where I'm thinking about the data and then going back to literature and figuring out how that fits with my work. And then I'm editing my own paper over and over again. So actually, I think don't view it as that you have to figure out all the science and then write the paper. Actually, once you've got some science to think about, start writing it. And that's how you can do the science. And at the end of it, you've kind of figured out the science and you've got something vaguely resembling a paper. So I think just not viewing it as a separate thing from the science and viewing it as something that can help you with making sense of the data that you have, maybe a useful step.
Thank you very much. We nearly kept to time. We're only a couple of minutes over, but I want to say thank you again to everyone on the panel for answering these questions. There was a lot of questions, and there were some that we didn't get to answer. So I apologize if your question was not answered. I'm going to stop the recording.